All right, we left our discussion looking at Sand Creek. I want to kind of go back to the prompts that we're looking at. How was the American frontier a war zone between two very different societies? The American society and the American Indian society had very much different ideas and concepts about the lands that they were encountering and where the conflict was. So, are you seeing some evidence of that? So, as you take your notes, pay attention that you want to find evidence to support a claim you make regarding that. When the second prompt is, how did American Indians resist the advancing frontier created by American settlers in its military? You're going to see more information on that in the presentation coming up. We'll be looking a lot at some of this stuff, and your reading that you've done will help you there. So let's move ahead. I think we're looking at the issue of what happened at Sand Creek. The Cheyenne and Arapaho forces were looking at the areas like in eastern Wyoming, the western Nebraska, and the Dakotas. They were fighting with local militia through the summer of 1864, also in Colorado, I should note, because that's where Sand Creek was. The Cheyenne chief Black Kettle had tired of the fighting, and so on the way to make peace, they camped at a place called Sand Creek, and they set up an American flag as a sign of peace, meaning that we are, accept American sovereignty here. We are stop fighting. So they basically, on the way to make peace, the group camped in Sand Creek. And there's Sand Creek. This is Colorado. It was still territory until 1876. It's right here. So we're looking at the border between Colorado and Kansas, right there in eastern Colorado. While most of the men in the group were out hunting, the United States Army Colonel John M. Shivington, a minister, by the way, too, and 700 Colorado volunteers arrived, and they came upon the encampment and they opened fire. It's interesting that you talk about how it's easier in history to see good guys and bad guys. I mean, we looked at abolitionists as somehow being heroes, obviously for being against slavery, but he was also a professed Indian hater. Indian hating was popular among some people in some of the churches. They saw them as not Christian, and there is Shivington right there. Approximately 200 of these people were killed. Most were women and children, so they went upon this camp that the people who were traditionally fighters that were also out hunting, so that this camp under American flag was really defenseless. And I like this. I saw this post here. It says, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is a right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Scalps are what we're after. I long to be wading in gore." And this is the Reverend John M. Shivington, the colonel in charge of the militias that fought at Sand Creek. So you talk about somebody who has a very clear agenda about American Indians. There he is. When news came back, these Shivington's men had brought these skulls and scalps into the city. I think it was Denver, kind of showing them off as like prizes. But many Americans were horrified, and the shock led to many Congress to call for reforms in government and Indian policy. And then also, the massacre also prompted raids of retaliation by the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Sioux, who were attempting to get revenge for this murder of what appeared to be defenseless women and children. The U.S. government attempted to try to create a peace commission. In the Southern Plains Indians, we're talking about south of that, not in the Northern Plains like in Idaho, but in the Southern Plains. The Southern Plains Indians signed a treaty of Medicine Lodge and agreed to give up much of their land for reservations in the Indian Territory. In the Treaty of Fort Laramie, moved them to a reservation in the Black Hills of South Dakota. This is areas like where Mount Rushmore is right now, in western South Dakota. Areas that, again, part of the reservation policy. So just something to think about. We're not going to be writing about this. But how did the Sand Creek Massacre lead to a new set of treaties? And how did Sand Creek reflect the nature of contact between American Indians and whites we've approached at the beginning of this lecture, that idea of a conflict of civilizations? There's little Bighorn right there, and that's what the Black Hills look like. They call them the Black Hills because the trees are so dark green they almost appear black. It's beautiful territory if you've ever been out like past Rapid City in western South Dakota, where you might find Mount Rushmore. In 1874, the United States government violated the treaty of, heck, that's only 6 years later. They sent in an army expedition into the Black Hills because there was suspicion that there was gold there. When gold was indeed discovered, the government attempted to try to renegotiate a new territory, but the Sioux, who felt like they had achieved and negotiated this as their territory, refused to negotiate. So there was a Lakota Sioux Indian chief who became known as Sitting Bull. He emerged as an important leader of the resistance of the Sioux Indians. He strongly opposed the intrusion of non-Indians into Sioux land and believed it was time to make a stand. In many cases, like the Black Hills regions were considered to be sacred land to the Sioux, kind of like the Holy Lands, like maybe what Jerusalem is to Judaism or Christianity. Many followed him, and by the spring of 1876, thousands of Sioux and who made allies with the Cheyenne joined his camp. So he created a relatively formidable force. And the Indians were camped near a stream known as Little Bighorn, and you can see where Little Bighorn is right here in the area here. So we're taking a look at there's South Dakota. There's where the Black Hills are, what we talked about. Here's Fort Laramie right there in Wyoming, and of course Sand Creek would have been down in this region here in Colorado. By late June, they had 2,500 men ready to fight. So the United States military needs to mobilize, and they organize a number of divisions, including Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, who was a Civil War veteran. About 600 members of the U.S. 7th Cavalry decided to attack. Now, Custer led a 200-man battalion into the camp, and he believed that that camp was a good time to attack. He didn't realize, though, that American Indians were waiting on the sidelines and were hiding. And when he came into the camp, his 200-man battalion was wiped out. But this would be the last victory for the Sioux. It was a very decisive one. But here's a case where you win the battle but lose the war, because in America, in Washington, he was considered a martyr and a hero. And of course, what Custer had represented was a very small fraction of America's military force. Custer, like many things we look at in the American Indian Wars, has become reevaluated. You know, like Columbus was once seen as a hero, but now has been reexamined for his treatment of American Indians. Custer, who was seen to be heroic, was now seen to be somebody who was reckless and oftentimes cruel. And you see, they play a lot with his caricature, and if you saw the movie Night in the Museum, kind of playing a little bit about with Custer as being somebody who wasn't very I guess you could say, very intelligent in terms of the way he used his force. Now, it's interesting to talk about perspectives. This is an American perspective, a painting of what there were no survivors at the Battle of Little Bighorn, but attempts to show what it looked like showed the heroic resistance of the American soldiers as they were encircled by American Indians. But this is American Indian view. It's not just a matter of perspective, but even style. You can see the style of American Indian painting, showing them destroying the American army at Little Bighorn. Now, the Sioux Indians were unhappy returning back to their reservation, and a Paiute Indian known as Wavoka began a religious revival. It's kind of interesting because it kind of represents kind of a combination of American Indian religion and Christianity. And we're going to see this actually in many different places on earth where Christianity and Europeans are kind of penetrating and growing, and people are kind of like American Indians or other native peoples are being pushed back, and they combine some of the Christian traditions with their own religion. They believed that somewhere along the line that the Great Spirit God would bring back a Messiah, a Jesus-like figure, a Redeemer, and when he would come back, he would kind of restore the world before white man, that the white men would disappear and American Indians would be returned back to the time when they were able to move the prairies at their own will. And it featured a ritual dance that was called the ghost dance. And the idea was that the ancestors would come back to life. It would also make the Indians bulletproof from the guns of the American soldiers. And keep in mind that these ideas were very, very dangerous to everybody. You know, to American Indians who felt they were bulletproof, they'd be emboldened to fight back. And of course, it would promote them to believe that God was on their side. Sitting Bull would join this cause, and some government officials feared that the movement might spark a rebellion because it would create confidence and anger among the American Indians who had, with a sense of resignation, accepted life on the reservation. He ordered his arrest, and a skirmish broke out, and eventually Sitting Bull was killed. So many Sioux further west joined with Bigfoot, another Sioux leader, at Wounded Knee, which is close by where the ghost dance began on the reservation. This is in South Dakota. The government wanted to arrest him too. These people were feared because they believed that the religious rituals would encourage Indian rebellion. And hoping to avoid conflict, Bigfoot was leading his group to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they made camp along the Wounded Knee Creek. And again, the American military, with their superior firepower, were fearful of this combination of American Indians. And Colonel James Forsyth in the 7th Cavalry, which was the same unit of that Custer had used earlier, not the same men, obviously, but the same unit, they ordered the seizure of Indian rifles, and the 500 soldiers surrounded the camp, and they began searching the teepees for weapons, and shooting began. And at the end, another 150 Sioux were killed, and 30 American soldiers were killed in the skirmish. This, in many ways, was one of the symbolic last gasps of American Indians. Kind of marked the end of the bloody conflict between U.S. government and the Plains Indians. So basically, again, you could take a look at how the Indians of the higher Great Plains, what happened, and the conflict, and how that conflict created eventually the end of American Indian sovereignty or freedom and independence in the West. Now, I want to look briefly at Nez Pierce. The Americans of the Western Great Plains were also forced on reservations. We're talking about here, we're in Idaho, and this is the Nez Pierce. They lived in parts of Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho primarily. They had surrendered much of their land in 1855, and they moved onto a reservation. But when settlers moved onto the reservation, the Nez Pierce didn't return in violence. But they were ordered to move to another reservation, and under their leader, Chief Joseph, they agreed to do so. But some young Nez Pierce were killed. 4 white settlers, however, and the Nez Pierce fled in fear. They were afraid that they would take responsibility collectively for the murder of the white settlers. And their plan was to cross the mountains of Montana into Canada, and they had gotten within 40 miles of the border in the harsh winter conditions. But when they were forced to surrender, and you saw part of Chief Joseph's speech, we saw it in the reading and the video, but this part of his speech at the end, which is kind of the ultimate surrender: I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. Again, kind of symbolic for all American Indians faced with the superior firepower of the American military. Now here's Geronimo. In the 1870s, we're into the southern parts of the plains in Arizona and New Mexico, and Army troops are going to move on the Apache leader Geronimo. He fled the reservation, and he and his followers began like a guerrilla or small raids, but they finally surrendered in 1886. And eventually he was sent to Florida in prison, and this would end armed resistance in the Southwest. So we looked at the Apache, the Nez Pierce, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, many of the great symbolic holdouts attempting to fight for independence. Their descendants now are either have assimilated or live on reservations, and there are pretty sizable Indian reservations in the western Dakotas, in Wyoming, and Arizona. And these people who identify with the American Indians look back and are still today, we'll talk about this later on, are still looking for and attempting to find their rights and treaties which have long been neglected. So like we talked about with the end of slavery, the end of slavery did not end the problem with Black Americans and finding places and freedom and equality in American society. American Indians are going to have a similar plight. So when you get into looking at the 1960s, you're going to see not only the right of the African Americans being pushed, but we also have a very vigorous American Indian movement that would be rekindled in the 1950s and 60s. So there you have it. Now take a look at the evidence you put together, and you need to construct the 2 essays as they've been put there. And if you have any questions, please email me.